Hi everybody, this is Stephen Malarchik, and this is my deep dive for Nursing 535, Health Promotion and Disease Prevention. We're going to talk about stress management and how it relates to our roles as advanced practice nurses. When searching for stress management on the CNOL website, on the database, for the last 5 years, when you just put in stress management, you come up with over 3,000 references. So using some of these references and some other references available, we're going to talk about stress management. These are some of the objectives. One of the first things we'll do is just kind of define stress, and then we'll talk about the pathophysiologic effects that stress has on our body, or the stress reaction. And then we'll talk about the relationship between stress and health promotion and disease prevention. And then we'll talk about some evidence-based interventions that we might be able to assist our patients with, or even ourselves for that matter, or our coworkers, to manage stress. So here's a couple of definitions. The first one is from the Tabors, and stress is defined as any physical, physiological, or psychological force that disturbs a person's equilibrium. The second one is from the American Psychological Association, and it's the pattern of specific and non-specific responses an organism makes to stimulus events that disturbs its equilibrium and tax or exceeds its ability to cope. We'll discuss in a little bit about how this actually disturbs the equilibrium, or another word for this equilibrium would be our homeostasis. How does stress affect homeostasis in our body? When you look at the term stress in the literature, you find a couple of different types of stress. And one of the stresses that many authors talk about is eustress, which is considered good stress. And that's the kind of stress that allows us to complete things, that allows us to complete the deep dive when it's assigned to us. It allows us to perform in an emergent situation as nurses. So it allows us to rise to a challenge. And even though it's termed good stress, we have the same stress reaction in our bodies that occurs, that we'll talk about in a little bit. The next word is kind of related to stress, and that's distress. And this would be considered a negative type of stress. It breaks down the person instead of challenging them to rise. And so this starts to have negative consequences. So the eustress would be considered a positive type of stress, distress, the negative type of stress. And then we can further break it down into different periods of stress, I guess. The first one would be acute stress. This would be the stress from demands and pressures from the near past, so things that just happened, or things that are going to happen soon. And again, this can be positive or negative. You can have eustress or distress acutely. You can have episodic acute stress, and so these are people that have, of course, episodes of this acute stress. And you may recognize some of these people around you. These might be the people that are always rushing around to be places but are never on time. People that always seem to be having bad things happen to them. Many people who worry about everything, kind of the worrywart type of person. And even many type A personalities suffer from episodic acute stress. So the last one is chronic stress, and this is kind of long-term stressful situations, the day-to-day constant wearing of a person down. And when you never give your body a chance to recover from this type of stress, then you start to see disease and mental health issues from the chronic stress. And these type of people that have chronic stress, they might not even recognize it anymore. But their lives are gradually being destroyed, or their minds or their bodies are. They don't anymore get the thrill of stress like they might get from acute stress or eustress. When we talk about stress reaction and what happens in our body when we are exposed to stress, whether good or bad, I thought Bonnie Raingruber, in her book, The Contemporary Health Promotion in Nursing Practice, one of our textbooks, gave a pretty good thought about it, where she said stress, whether real or anticipated, provokes a physiologic response in the body through its release of specific hormones that target certain cells and tissues in the body. And then, depending on how long that our body cells are and tissues are exposed to that, we can have different pathologies arise or different problems occur from this stress reaction. When we look at the stress reaction, we can kind of break it down into 3 different time zones, if you will, of how these stress reaction can affect us. So one is reactive. So a stressor happens, our body reacts to it. The other one is anticipatory. So maybe you're getting ready to give a big talk in front of a bunch of people, and you're feeling the effects of the stress even before the stressor has happened. Conditioned might be when you encounter a stress that you've encountered before, and you automatically have the same stress response. So perhaps you've been in a car wreck when you have gone through say like an intersection or something, and now every time you go through an intersection, you kind of have a stress reaction. And the more severe forms of this we see as post-traumatic stress disorder. So the very basic type of reaction is our flight or fight response is activated. And so we encounter something that's stressful, and we basically, our brain, the hypothalamus pituitary axis, just kicks in, and it kicks in our sympathetic stimulation. And we know that the neurotransmitters for our sympathetic stimulation are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those have immediate effects on our body, no matter what the stress is. Doesn't matter if it's acute, chronic, we're going to get some of this type of reaction. And so the immediate effects are that we get pupil dilation, our blood sugar rises, we get bronchial dilation, our blood supply to our muscles increase, and this is because our heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate all increase. And this kind of gets us ready to either flee from the stress or fight. And so it's kind of our ingrained response. And what it does for us is it makes us kind of hypervigilant, hyper aroused, and anxious, or any other kind of protective type of emotional response that we might have to deal with the stress. There's other hormonal things that happen in the body, and we'll talk about those next. During the sympathetic fight for flight response, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system kicks in, or the RAS system. And we know that the renin and angiotensin increases blood pressure, and then the aldosterone, which is also released from the kidneys from being stimulated by the angiotensin, is it serves to stop water and sodium from being secreted from the kidneys, and so that again augments our blood pressure. So again, you can see if somebody has this chronically, now we might have a hypertension type problem. The HPA axis also kicks in, and we talked about that, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And the hypothalamus releases the corticotropin releasing hormone. And this hormone basically serves to release ACTH, which is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, but also just by itself, as it moves around the body, it can also boost attention, decrease appetite, and increase feelings of anxiety. So the CRH causes the ACTH to be released from the pituitary. That's the second part of the HPA axis, and then that travels to the adrenals, and then our stress hormone cortisol is released, which is a glucocorticoid. The other thing that also happens is that not only does it release cortisol, but it actually augments the response of the sympathetic nervous system to go ahead and release more epi and norepi. And so we kind of get in this loop of augmentation of the stress response. This hormone cortisol, also considered a stress hormone, it does several things acutely. So it stimulates the release of glucose. I think I already talked about that. It stimulates the release of lipids, and it stimulates the release of amino acids. And this is all for the short term to, fight or flight. In the long term, it starts to have detrimental effects on our health. So when we're talking about more than just a couple hours of stress every day, we're talking about weeks to months of continuous chronic stress. We have some pretty severe, or we can have severe effects on our body. In our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala all have a role in stress reaction, and they're connected by neural circuits. You can see them here on the picture where they're located in our brain. And when you think about the prefrontal cortex, it allows us to have memory of events as they're happening, and so this is kind of our short-term or working memory. The hippocampus is essential also for short-term memory and aids in people having good spatial orientation about how to get from point A to point B. And it also affects the mood, the patient's mood, and this talks directly back and forth with the amygdala. And we know that this connection between the two kind of moderates the HPA, or the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Interestingly, the hippocampus is one of the first areas to show damage when Alzheimer's develops. The amygdala, it's actually the detection part of our brain. So it's the thing that perceives threats and then responds to threats by activating the HPA axis, which of course activates the fight or flight. Cortisol over time works negatively on the on these areas. So in an acute situation, it can be good, but over time what they see is that the prefrontal cortex from cortisol stops working as well, and the amygdala starts to work more. So you can think about what that might do, where you might have an increased amygdala output, which might increase your HPA, which increases basically your stress reaction. And this can be responsible for causing mood disorders, increasing anxiety, and possibly even lead to PTSD. So we know over time that chronic stress can increase inflammation in the body, and then we know that inflammation causes or contributes to several different pathologies in patients. It can cause immune suppression. We can have an increase in cardiovascular disease or heart disease. It can cause depression, chronic stress can. We've already talked about how the effects of cortisol and stress on the brain can lead to PTSD. It can lead to ulcers, colitis, and adult onset diabetes. One of the things that's just coming out now, and Reingruber in the textbook refers to it, is the effect of the stress response on epigenetics. And so we know that it has some kind of effect on gene expression through methylation and histone acetylation. And so we're just now scratching the surface of the epigenetic type effects that the stress response has on the patient. Since 2006, the American Psychological Association has conducted a yearly poll in August, and it kind of measures the amount of stress people are perceiving in their lives. And what they've noticed and what they had heard was that there was a big increase in people being stressed out about political situations. And so they actually repeated it in January of 2017, and they released a report about it. And some of the things that they found out is that, of course, we can probably believe this, stress has increased dramatically over the last 1 to 2 years in the population. 3 in 10 Americans, this is from the January report, 3 in 10 Americans report that their stress level has elevated in the last year. 20% report extreme levels of distress. So on a scale of 1 to 10, these people, 1 in 5 people chose 8, 9, or 10. And then these extreme levels of stress and distress have been causing health concerns or health symptoms. And so from August, 71% had said that they had experienced some type of stress reaction or symptom of stress over the last month. And in just, what was that, 4 months, it went to 80% in January. And this includes symptoms such as headache, feeling overwhelmed, feeling nervous or anxious, or feeling depressed or sad. And so we know already that, from the health promotion side, if we can help people with their stress and to manage their stress, that we can keep diseases from forming. And so that's part of the disease prevention part also. And then people might actually, present to us with these symptoms, maybe chronic headaches, depression, sadness, and maybe they don't realize it's from chronic stress, and we might be able to help them with methods of coping. So this obviously, relates to our role as advanced practice nurses, providing primary care to patients. And it obviously has a direct link to both health promotion and to disease prevention in the long term. This chart is out of that report from the American Psychological Association, and it shows how people manage their stress between genders, so between men and women. And these are actually the healthy ways of managing stress. It doesn't actually report on the unhealthy ways of managing stress. But we can see exercise or walking, going online, watching television, which is probably really not helping. Neither is probably going online. Spending time with friends or family, reading, praying, and eating. One assessment that's available is this STRAIN test, which is Stress and Adversity Inventory. And the patient takes this, they can take it at home, they can take it at the office, and it gives some, what looks like to be some pretty good information to the primary care provider about how your patients are dealing with stress and what their stress exposure is. It was done by a UCLA doctor, put together. It's not free. I found that out. I thought I'd take it, and I didn't want to pay what they wanted for it. It's $450 a month and you can use it up to 24 times a month. And then they have prices that go up from there. But it is available, I guess if you thought it would be useful in your patient population. The Holmes Brahe Life Stress Inventory might be one that you could use with your patient. I found it for free on the internet, and I found a couple articles dealing with like burnout and compassion fatigue that used it as a validated tool to assess the amount of stress and relate it to kind of health outcomes or health concerns that may arise. The American Psychological Association also makes theirs available. At the end of this report, all of the questions that are asked to the survey respondents are listed. These are three that UpToDate recommends: the Stanford Acute Stress Reaction Questionnaire, the Acute Stress Disorder Interview, and the Acute Stress Disorder Scale. So if you have any of these available to you, you might be able to use these. There is a pretty good resource on the internet provided by the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Department of Defense. And of course, it has to do with military personnel, but it has transfers over pretty well to civilian population. This particular chart was taken from that, and it's based on the DSM-5, and it basically has the guideline for diagnosing acute stress disorder. This one also came from that same report, and this is for diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder based on the DSM-5. And excuse me, the nice thing is that it's got a lot of recommendations and goes over signs and symptoms, and it's very up to date. It was just released this year. When we talk about treating stress, one of the first things we want to do is make sure that the patient isn't choosing unhealthy options for treating their stress. So we want to evaluate them to make sure that they're not stress eating, they haven't changed their eating habits, excuse me, to something bad, alcohol intake, drugs, anything that would be more harmful, at-risk behavior, things like that. We want to make sure and find out if that's occurring, and then help them to resolve that. When we consider treatment, one of the biggest parts of the treatment, as with almost anything else, is education. So non-pharmacological forms would include education, and we can help the patients kind of recognize how they stress and what their sources of stress are, and to recognize the signs of them being stressed. We can encourage them to get regular exercise, even though regular exercise causes an actual release in cortisol. They're not sure why, but it helps fix the problems with that cortisol from stress causes to the brain. They think it might have something to do with dopamine. So if we can encourage them to get regular exercise. There are several relaxing activities that the APA recommends, things such as yoga, reading, relaxation, different relaxation techniques, and you can find all those on their website. We can help the patient set goals and priorities, or if they can just come up with a list so that they're not stressing about things that don't really matter. We can recommend that they stay connected with family and friends, and that they're not becoming isolated. And we can consider clinical trials for that. When I went to clinicaltrials.gov and put in stress, there was 745 studies that were actively recruiting for different stress-related research. So they could even do that. And of course, if they're having acute stress reactions or PTSD, or suffering pretty bad from chronic stress, we can also recommend psychotherapy for the patient. Pharmacologically, we definitely want to manage the diseases, because stress can cause many diseases. So you might have hypertension, diabetes, some other type of problem, ulcers, colitis. So we want to go ahead and treat those. The Veteran Affairs DoD article showed that there was moderate support and evidence for using these medications, these SSRIs and SNRIs. And so for the rest of the medications, there's really no good evidence showing that they actually work for stress-related problems. The next two slides present some information from two studies that have been done about skydivers. And the reason why I found this interesting is a lot of times we might get to take care of patients that experience acute stressful events, and maybe that kind of becomes chronic stress in their lives. We might think of combat veterans, police, firefighters, EMS responders, ER nurses, ER staff, ICU staff, anyone that sees a lot of stressful events. And these slides talk about how we perceive stress and then how the stress actually affects us. So when this study was completed in 1967, they asked people that were skydivers to rate their amount of stress. And you can see that the dark line are the inexperienced, so the novice jumpers, and then the less bold line are the experienced jumpers. So you can see where it starts on the left. It begins the night before the jump, and inexperienced jumpers had a low amount of stress, and of course their stress peaked when they were ready to jump, when they got the signal that they could jump, and then it rapidly fell off after they jumped. Interestingly, the experienced members actually had more self-perceived stress in the evening, and then after the evening before the jump, and then right after the jump. So how this was perceived was that people who had more experience with stressful events when they were actually doing the event had lower amounts of stress as compared to inexperienced people. And so, that kind of makes sense. If you are experienced with a particular activity, you learn how to cope with it, and the actual stress is not perceived as being as high when you're performing that activity. Now, maybe before and after, you actually do experience stress because you know either what's coming up or what you just experienced. And so, maybe, that makes some sense intuitively. In 2013, this follow-up study was done where they looked at novice jumpers and experienced jumpers and measured their cortisol levels. And we've already talked about cortisol being the stress hormone. So the more stress you're having, the higher your cortisol levels go. So the dark bold line is the experienced jumper, and the dashed line is the novice jumper, and they tested cortisol levels just before they jumped, when they landed, and then an hour after they landed. And what they found was that there was no statistically significant difference between both groups, but both experienced similar levels of cortisol. And so what this tells us is that even though people might become used to stressful events, they may think that they're handling stressful events, like their perception of it is that they are handling it fine, just like the first slide showed. But really, they're experiencing the stress response the same as a novice person would. And when we have that stress response, we know that if we have it over and over and over again, we can start to see the damage on the cellular level in the brain and how the brain works. And there's some questions again as to whether that can cause epigenetic changes and maybe lead to disease. I hope this helped you formulate a plan for when you encounter patients with stress reactions and understanding what they're going through, and how, as nurse practitioners, that we can help them. I think, in reality, most of our patients are undergoing some type of stress reaction, even if it's just from what brought them in that day. Maybe, they have a cold, or they're just not feeling well, all the way up to chronic stress and PTSD. As the study showed from the APA, the amount of stress that Americans are undergoing right now is increasing by quite a bit. If you want further information, the APA has a lot of resources on their website for both patients and practitioners, and that's where a lot of my information came from, was the American Psychological Association. And then that other report from the VA Department of Defense is very thorough and very helpful, and I think it's well researched and evidence based. So, okay, thanks.